So in this session, we're going to look at the way that we can examine the witnesses to the Old Testament and see whether they give us a picture of a reliable text, or whether the text of the Old Testament's been perpetually changed. Occasionally you get people who say the Old Testament text developed with time. Well, the evidence doesn't say that, and I want to show you the sort of scale of evidence that we have. So let's start off by thinking about the sort of history of the Old Testament. It goes back to a little bit before 1400 BC, when the law is written. That's when the children of Israel are crossing the wilderness, and the law is given to them. And then other bits of the Old Testament add to them as the history goes on. And it carries on for about 1,000 years, at the end of which, well, the last thing we have in the Old Testament is the return of Nehemiah to Judea, and that happens about in 430 BC. Maybe the Old Testament's written a little tiny bit after that, but basically up to that point, we have prophets who are writing the books and who can also verify that the books they've got are in the condition that they should be in. And in Jewish tradition, the last person to look over the Bible to make sure it was written in the correct way was Ezra, who is more or less contemporary with Nehemiah there. So we've got prophets who can guarantee the text of the Old Testament up to about 430 BC. But then, of course, we've got the New Testament as well. And there are apostles, and the apostles also, if there's been a great change in the Old Testament, they will be able to say that. They don't. But when it comes to a very detailed look at the text from the quotations in the New Testament, you've got the problem that the New Testament's in Greek and the Old Testament's in Hebrew. So we've got translation issues. You can look at the possible original for a Greek sentence and say, yes, that looks like the Hebrew sentence we've got from the Old Testament, but it's always a slight problem because it's a translation. It's important to think also how the copies of the Bible at the time were standardized. So the law was written first. It's got the copies kept in the temple in Jerusalem. And then as the prophets write additional books, those are added to the collection, and there's a collection held in the temple in Jerusalem. And then that's reconstructed, but it carries on in the second temple. So time of Ezra and Nehemiah, there's a second temple already standing, and the standard copy, as it were, of the Old Testament is kept there in the temple. And in fact, a copy of that, a very carefully made and very carefully verified copy, is kept available so that people can go along and they can compare the scroll they've got with that, and they can make sure they've got their copy correct. And this idea that there's a copy that can be consulted in the temple, and in fact that there's a set of scribes, you get those in the New Testament referred to, but they're referred to in more detail to explain who they are by various people in the 1st century AD, Philo, Josephus, a chap called Aristeas, and it appears also in the Talmud, and it appears in Karaite works. So there are a whole load of sources which verify that this main copy of the Bible was kept there, and that there was in fact a school of people whose job it was to make sure that other copies were accurate. So standard copies were then made from the temple copy. They might be taken to other parts of the Jewish world. They might go out to Galilee, or they might go to Babylon, or even Greece, and people would make synagogue copies from those. If they lived a bit nearer, they'd make their synagogue copies from the copy in the temple. And then it all, well, yes, the further copies made from standard copies, but it all goes wrong in 70 AD when the temple is destroyed, and you can't go to the temple anymore for your main copy of the Old Testament. Instead, well, they had to reconstruct a standard text. And the people who did that were called Masoretes, really means passes on of tradition. And they make a new text, which is made from the copies, the best copies they can get. So that some of the standard copies, make the temple copy, are around, and there are a fair number of first generation copies after that. The Masoretes put them very carefully together. And so again, back to the chronology, we've got a standard copy held through the tabernacle, the temple. We've got the first generation copy up to the Babylonians come. That's probably destroyed by the Babylonians, but there are copies from that, so first generation copies that are available. And the text of the Old Testament is reconstructed in the time of the return, and it's copies of that held in the temple up until the destruction in 70 AD, and then they reconstruct the text of the Old Testament, or the Jewish tradition does, using the manuscripts that they've got, which are still quite close to the original copy. And they're helped by by the way that Jewish rabbis interpreted the Old Testament. And they made a tremendous amount of comments on it, in books, again, distributed all over the Jewish world. And the interpretation that they're making depends on single letters quite often, certainly single words, and precise details of spelling. And the big man whose name goes behind that kind of interpretation was a Rabbi Akiba, who died in 135 AD. So they've got plenty of Old Testament manuscripts, which are pretty good. And they've also got commentaries on the Old Testament, which go down to the single word and single letter level, and they can put those together and make a text of the Old Testament in Hebrew. And then standard copies of those are distributed throughout the Jewish world. Quite useful, because every now and again there's a pogrom or there's an invasion and the bits of it get destroyed. Because it's distributed, the whole thing survives. And that text is called the Masoretic text because it's put together by the Masoretes, the passers on of tradition. So expanding the time scale a little bit, we've got some witnesses to the Old Testament text. The oldest one of the Masoretic manuscripts we've got is the Aleppo Codex. That was copied in about 920 AD. It's called the Aleppo Codex because it was held in a synagogue in Aleppo, in Syria. Unfortunately, that synagogue was torched in about 1947 during anti-Jewish riots, which surrounded the sort of early stages of setting up the state of Israel. And the manuscript disappeared. Fortunately, been photographed. Every page had been photographed, so the text wasn't lost, but the manuscript disappeared. Reappeared a lot later, although it was now missing a folio. It's missing quite a large chunk. Photographs exist, but that chunk disappeared. A couple more pages have turned up later. That's now in a museum in Jerusalem, no longer in Aleppo, which is probably a good thing because the Aleppo synagogue got destroyed again in the recent fighting in Syria. The oldest absolutely complete manuscript of the Masoretic text now, the Aleppo Codex not being complete anymore, is the Leningrad Codex. Again, photocopies of that exist all over the place, just like the Aleppo Codex. That's almost 100 years later than the Aleppo Codex, but it's identical letter for letter. And there are various other manuscripts which have pages missing, or which have sometimes whole books missing, which appear between those two. That's the Codex Sassoon. It's recently been auctioned, reached a fabulous amount of money, but there are plenty of others around. So the Masoretic text, we have manuscripts that go back to before 1000 AD. That's a picture of the page of the Aleppo Codex. Quite interesting to look at. You can see what you have here in the columns is the text of the Old Testament. And then you have various different bits of comment for the copiers. So these bits down the middle are the small Masorah. It's called these copies are called Masorah. They're there to help scribes to make sure that they get the text correct when they copy it out. They point out strange spellings, point out odd places where dots go. There's sometimes when you read the Old Testament, traditionally you don't read the word that's written, you put in a different word for it. That's in there. There are other bits of notes for copyists, the larger Masorah, which is here at the top and the bottom of the columns. And then there's a big Masorah at the start, which gives information, and at the back there's another set of notes, which is tables and numbers and a concordance, effectively. So that's all checked against to make sure everything works. So this apparatus starts off being developed in the 1st century AD. By the 10th century AD, it is absolutely complete, and you can check anything on the manuscript against the apparatus. And the tradition means that you get a very consistent copy. All the synagogue manuscripts in the world are hand copied, but they're all identical. Every single one of these letters is the same, even the dots are the same. There may be difference in the notes for copyists. Now that happens. One of the differences you do get a little bit are what's called the matres lectionis, mothers of reading or mother of reading. So that's two different ways of spelling the word David. That's the old way of doing it. D, and then that's a V or a U, and that's another D. So it could be Daud or David or Davad. There's all sorts of things it could be, but here they've added a Yud in the middle. That's a slightly later version of it, and that becomes David. The Yud indicates an I sound every time. So you've got consonants which are added to the text to indicate which vowel is intended. Those are standardized as well in the Masorah. There's some variation in the dots that go above and below the letters, diacritical marks. There's some variation in the marginal comments, but by the end, anything that can be measured or counted is measured or counted. They know the middle letter of every column, how many letters there are in the column, how many alepphs, how many beths, how many gimels, and so on. It's if it can be measured or it can be counted, they've done it, and it's there in the tables, and they do that afterwards and check this is an absolutely correct page for this manuscript. If the sheet is defective, it's destroyed, and another sheet is made and put into the scroll when it's fastened together, or in the codex like this, when it's fastened together and it's bound. And that's the text that they now use in a modern synagogue. There are actually two different Masorah, two different Masoretic texts, one from Ben Asher, one from Ben Naphtali. The Asher text is the one that is in use. In synagogues, the Ben Naphtali text sort of vanished. But there are not many differences between them. The differences in the apparatus, in the Masorah, not in the text. There are actually 8 consonantal differences. Those consonantal differences are in the matres lectionis. The words are exactly the same. So that's one set of manuscripts we've got. There are hundreds of them, but they're all identical. Just hundreds, there are probably tens of thousands of them, but they're all absolutely identical. There's no difference between them. Now come to another one, the Samaritan Pentateuch. So the Masoretic text, the one that's traditionally used in synagogues, was copied by Jewish scribes very, very carefully, very well done. But there's a separate set of Hebrew manuscripts copied by Samaritans. Obviously, there are a lot fewer Samaritans. There are a lot fewer of these manuscripts. And what we've got is just the first 5 books of laws that the Samaritans don't keep, the historical books or the prophets or the Psalms. But it's held by the Samaritan community, and as we all know, the Samaritans and the Jews don't have a lot of contact. So it's an independent set of copies. And in fact, there are about 6,000 variants between the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Masoretic text, but they're single letters. Nearly all of them are these matres lectionis, where there's this extra vowel in to show how you should pronounce it, that they exist in the Samaritan Pentateuch, has more of them, and not in the Masoretic text. Occasionally it's the other way around, but that's most of what the differences are. The words are the same, spelling is ever so slightly different. Occasionally you get a variation that agrees with the Greek translation, the Septuagint, and you get special Samaritan alterations, so that the not 10 commandments or 11 commandments. The 11th commandment is to build an altar on Mount Gerizim, which is where the Samaritan sanctuary is. You can guess where those came from. Almost certainly they just added in by the Samaritans. Might say, well, we've got the truth from God, so that must be there. And there occasionally are two words that appear in a different order. So, in fact, the Samaritan Pentateuch is very, very similar to the Masoretic text. The differences are in spelling and a few additional Samaritan bits to it. So, chronology, well, the Samaritans really start up when the Assyrians take the Israelites away from the northern kingdom and distribute them around the Assyrian Empire. And they then settle other people in from Assyrian provinces, are settled in Israel to look after the land. And those pick up the Jewish religion and become Samaritans. Of course, the Jews themselves disappear off to Babylon. They're taken captive by the Babylonians. And when they return, there is some needle between the Samaritans and the Jews. So you get Sanballat the Horonite, who's the leader of the Samaritans, is having trouble with the Jews who've returned, or maybe say the other way around, but there's a definite break with Judea at this point. So after that, the Samaritans and the Jews have almost no contact. So at that point, there's no possibility of the Samaritan Pentateuch being compared with the Jewish scriptures and corrections going between them. It's independent from that time. So we've got an independent witness to the text of the Old Testament, which goes back to well before the Masoretic text is being put together. So it's an independent copy. And well, unfortunately, the manuscripts we've got aren't that old. The Samaritans say that this Abisha scroll was actually made by Moses or by one of Moses's companions. Right back. It's written in the very old Paleo-Hebraic script. Samaritan scriptures are. But people who've looked at it in any detail say, well, first of all, it's not one person that's made it, several people, and the shapes of the letters have changed slightly. And we would date this somewhere between the 12th and the 14th century. In fact, different bits at slightly different times. So it may be that it's a later manuscript itself, but nonetheless, it's an independent witness to the text of the Old Testament. Targum, right. This is now translation into Aramaic. So Targums are Aramaic translation of the Old Testament. And it is a tradition of translation which goes back to the time of Ezra. And we actually get to quote from the Old Testament here. So in Nehemiah chapter 8, you get the reading the law to the people, and not all the people can understand. A lot of them don't speak Hebrew anymore. They speak Aramaic, and there's a list of names. That's off with Jeshua in Nehemiah 8 verse 7, who that he says at the end of a list of names, they help the people to understand the law while the people remain in their places. They read from the book, from the law of God clearly, and they gave the sense so that people understood the reading. So there's a sort of, it's not just a translation, it's a sort of commentary that's going on at the same time. And that's where Targum begins. So what would happen is that they would read the text in the synagogue in Hebrew, and a lot of the congregation would understand Hebrew, would understand what was going on, but some wouldn't. They would speak Aramaic instead, especially if they lived in Babylon. And they would then read, or they would then have an interpreter who would interpret that section of text for them. But that became a sort of sermon as well. It wasn't just a straight translation. So it's rather loose. The Living Bible, or worse, And they would then add bits of interpretation to it. Occasionally they add additional stories to it. So there's a Targum of Esther from the 1st century AD or the 2nd century AD, which contains a rather fanciful version of the arrival of the Queen of Sheba to visit Solomon. Nothing at all to do with Esther, but somehow it's got into the interpretation that was being given. So if you think about an exhortation, you're exhorting on a particular passage, but you might bring in other things as well, and that's what happens to the people who are doing the Targum, who are translating into Aramaic. Now, they're written down 2nd to 4th century, but Jewish way of thinking at the time was you go back to tradition. So someone would have heard an earlier translator producing the Targum, and he would use the same words and the same stories that he'd remembered from a previous translator, and they on going back and back and back. And so you've probably got in the Targums that are written down now an oral echo of a tradition. It might have been changed so the words aren't exactly the same, but nonetheless traditional will be very similar to what had gone back into the past. So the Targums are witnesses to an earlier text than when they were actually written down, although it's difficult to say exactly how much before that. So looking at the chronology of it, the Targums start off, the first oral translations begin towards the end of the Old Testament time of Ezra, time of Nehemiah, in the return from the captivity in Babylon. But the written Targum starts possibly in the 1st century, and Targums then appear, and we get manuscripts that go on for a bit. We've got Targum of Esther from the 1st century. The two big Targums that we've got are the Targum of the Torah, Targum Onkelos, and Jewish scholars would put that in the 2nd century AD. They would identify Onkelos with a particular historical figure who lived at that time. Some of the more critical people saying, yeah, maybe a 4th century AD writing, but nonetheless, we're getting quite early. We're getting before the earliest Masoretic manuscripts. Targum Jonathan is a bit earlier than that. That's the prophets only. And again, these are the two official Targums, as it were. These are the two that get read out still in the Yemen, got read out all over the place where people spoke Aramaic as the main interpretation of the law. There are other unofficial Targums that appear as well. So we've got the law, we've got the prophets. Officially, there are no Targum of the writings, officially that is, but there are plenty actually of unofficial Targums of the writings, which again go back to this same sort of period. So, like I mentioned, the Targum of Esther, 1st century AD. Esther isn't in either the prophets or in the law; it's in the writings. The Septuagint. Sometimes this is a little controversial, but this is the history that one has of it. It's a translation of the Old Testament into Koine Greek, into the same kind of Greek that the New Testament is written in. It's not ordinary classical Greek. It's a slightly older version of it than the New Testament Greek. And the earliest translation is made in the reign of Ptolemy II, who was the Ptolemaic king of Egypt at the time, and it was then put into the library in Alexandria, and there are various probably legendary accounts of what happened, how 70 scholars were used in the translation. Some versions say 72 scholars. That's why the abbreviation for the Septuagint is LXX. It's the Roman number for 70, the 70 translators. And Septuagint, of course, 70. But it didn't stay as it was revised, and there were additional translations that were put in. Some bits of the Septuagint are pretty literal, especially in the law of Moses. Other bits, like Daniel, are very much on the Targum model. They're pretty loose translations, and you get additional stories added in. So the story of Bel and the dragon and Judith and such like things get added into the Targum as it's going along. The New Testament quotes a lot from the Septuagint. Paul in his letters will often quote the Septuagint. The reason I suspect is because that's what the people he was writing to had. They had a copy of the Septuagint available. They could check his words in it, and they possibly knew it quite well, the way we tend to know the authorized version because we read it so often. And it becomes adopted by the Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, as its official Old Testament. Now, again, it's copied separately from the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is copied by Jewish scribes. The Septuagint is copied by Greek Orthodox scribes for the main part. The two don't talk to one another. The Greek Orthodox Church historically, like the Catholic Church historically, was pretty anti-Jewish, and they didn't sit there and compare notes with one another. So again, let's get the chronology in. So Ptolemy Philadelphus is 3rd century BC, and some people think it's just the law. The tradition says it's more than that, but at least the law was translated in his reign. So that's the Septuagint, but other books certainly are added to it. So some of the books seem to be translated a bit later than that. Those may be revisions of an earlier translation, or they may be just added to it. We don't know. That's what we've got. The older ones went if they did. And then in the 2nd century AD, other translations are made. Different people are adding their translations to it, and there are alternatives. And some manuscripts have an alternative translation. So they won't have the original translation. They'll have a later translation that's perhaps a bit better. In there, New Testament sometimes cites it, so we can pick up what the text might be from the New Testament. In the 3rd century, Chapel Origen put together a 6-fold witness to the Old Testament. It has the Old Testament in Hebrew written in Greek characters. It has Septuagint, and then 3 additional translations. It would be a wonderful document to have. It'd be a really useful textual source. Unfortunately, it's vanished. There are just a few pages of it that still exist. They're very useful, but there's only a few pages. And the oldest texts of the New Testament are the great codices, the Codex Sinaiticus Aleph and the Codex Vaticanus B, which contain the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, and it's in the Septuagint version. One other point about it, there are sometimes alternatives. So Jeremiah, for example, there seems to have been a sort of shortened Reader's Digest version of Jeremiah around, and sometimes that appears in a Septuagint manuscript instead of the full text of Jeremiah that is in the Masoretic text, which is the one you'll find in your Bible. Other witness, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And again, everyone thinks about the ones at Khirbet Qumran. That's the main scrolls. The scrolls there were buried in 68 AD. The Romans were arriving over the horizon, and the people must have very hurriedly buried their scrolls in caves and then scattered. And they were never found. They were never touched again until, well, a couple of manuscripts were discovered by a chap whose dog went down a hole and brought them out in medieval times. But most of them were discovered in 1947 and a little bit after that. First of all by Arab shepherds who were herding sheep in the area, and then by archaeologists who dug the area up, and then even more by Arab shepherds who seem to be much better at finding antiquities than the archaeologists were. But a lot of the scrolls they did find were Bible scrolls. But there are others as well. So the next lot were lost at Masada. The Romans besieged Masada and then finally captured it. and some scrolls have been found there as well. And then in 135 AD, well, it ended in 135 AD, just shortly before that there was another revolt of Jews in the land of Palestine. And there are two sites where manuscripts were buried. One is the Wadi Murabaat, and the other is the Nahal Eva. And we've got scrolls from there as well. So altogether, there are more than 230 biblical manuscripts discovered. A lot more than that, all the manuscripts, but biblically, more than 230 manuscripts discovered. And there we go. That's how many manuscripts there are of each book. The only book that doesn't have any copies at all is the book of Esther. It might just be that there are word book copies of Esther. They've been destroyed. We haven't found them. Or it may be that the people at Qumran and so on didn't really like the book of Esther, so they didn't make copies of it. The problem is that some of those manuscripts are quite fragmentary, that you can only get little bits of the manuscript, but there are others that are almost complete. And altogether, I did a quick survey of it, and it's 64% of the chapters in the Old Testament are represented by the Dead Sea Scrolls, but a lot of those only part of the chapters. So for Chronicles particularly, that's the one that's worst. It's one scroll for 1 and 2 Chronicles. You've got the end of one chapter, the beginning of another, so it's 2 chapters, but it's only 3 verses. Just the end of one and the beginning of another. So you have to watch out. Many of the chapters are incomplete, but we've got a bit more than half of the text of the Old Testament in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we can compare that with other ancient manuscripts and see how it matches up. The oldest scrolls from the Dead Sea Scrolls, well, just explain what this means here. That identifies the scroll. 1Q says which cave it was dug out of. So that one was in the first cave at Qumran. IS, the document, that's the book of Isaiah. And A is identified. So the first copy of the book of Isaiah is A, the second one is B, and so on. And this scroll was copied somewhere around 125 BC. There are older copies of Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's probably the oldest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's K4, it's a copy of Jeremiah, and that's copied definitely before 200 BC. That's getting a little difficult to put the dates together from the handwriting when you get that far back, because we've got so few documents to compare it with. But radiocarbon gives a similar kind of date, actually a little bit earlier than that. Another of the oldest copies, that's also from K4. That's Job. It's called Paleo-Job because it's written in the old Hebrew alphabet, not the square characters we're used to. So that's a Paleo-Hebraic alphabet before 200 BC or around about that time. The Jeremiah one is older than that, but they're still both very old. There's another old one, that's Ecclesiastes Kohelet in Hebrew, and that's between 150 and 175 BC. This is the controversial one, Daniel, manuscript Daniel from K4, and they put it at 125 BC or earlier. It's always quoted at around 225 BC. Now, the problem is that if you are a radical critic of the Old Testament, you will say the book of Daniel can't have been written until the last detailed prophecy was fulfilled, which is the coming of the Romans, which effectively happened in 167 BC. So it couldn't have been written before that. We'll put it at about 150 BC. And here it is, clearly scripture, clearly being copied as scripture. The scribes at Qumran made their scriptural documents look different from the other ones, so you can tell if they thought it was scripture. And the copy of Daniel was definitely accepted as scripture when it was written. So they tend to say, well, what's the latest it could have been written? And the latest it could possibly, if you really work on it, have been written is 125 BC. But it's probably written rather before that. And some people have said it goes as early as 150 BC. Some people say that's a more likely date for it. But the point is that it shows that Daniel is being accepted and read as scripture very soon after the Romans turned up in the area. That's the oldest Septuagint copy we've got. It's again K4 LXX. It's the Septuagint, and that's Leviticus, and that's the second of those. That's about 100 BC. So that's the oldest Septuagint we've got. So again, look at the timelines. The scrolls from Qumran go back to about 200 BC, and they end very suddenly in 68. Well, they end a little bit before that. They couldn't be, they were buried in 68, but I want to say that were copied in the 1st century AD before they were actually running away. And there's another set which were buried in the Nahal Hebrew in the Wadi Murabaat, and they seem to have been copied in the 1st century AD. But it brings everything a lot earlier. It's more than 1,000 years from the Aleppo Codex to the Dead Sea Scrolls. What we find is that, well, there are plenty of scriptural manuscripts there. Some of those are almost identical to the Masoretic text. They don't have the dots. They're not invented yet. The diacritical marks aren't there. But and occasionally matrix lectiones are different. But they're very like the Masoretic text. One or two places where the Septuagint is different, you find that the Dead Sea Scrolls will follow the Septuagint. A couple of places they follow the Samaritan Pentateuch. Thing to watch out for, they're not copied quite so rigorously. The Masoretic text is absolutely tied down every letter. The Dead Sea Scrolls are written by some rather dozy scribes occasionally, and they're often dictated, which is forbidden for the Masoretic manuscripts as well. Not only that, but their scribes didn't have access to originals in the temple. They couldn't go to the temple and check their scrolls against it because they had some kind of argument on with the temple authorities. And they're certainly a lot less rigorous in their methods. There's a fragment from Jeremiah. It's the 4Q Jeremiah A, and you can see what's happened. They've made a copy, and he's left some text out, quite a large chunk of it. Everything between Jeremiah 7 verse 28 and Jeremiah 9 verse 2 is missing. And that's been read through then, and the corrector has said, silly scribe, you've missed a bit out. And said, well, I knew there was a bit missing. I've left a gap. Well, he had, but nothing like enough. So the corrector starts to write in rather tiny letters in the gap the bit that's missing. But the gap is nowhere near big enough. So he then goes sideways down the margin, and then finally upside down in the bottom margin, because you've just got to find the space somewhere to get it in. That would never have happened in the Masoretic text. If they found that gap, they'd rip that page out the scroll, they would have copied it out correctly, and they would have sewn another page in, and possibly in this case another 2 pages into the gap. But the Qumran people are prepared to take this rather awkward step of writing in the margin and upside down. So what we got, there's the witnesses to the text so far. We've got the Masoretic text, the Targums, Septuagint, Samaritan Pentateuch, all of them going back before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, apart from the Masoretic text. Another source, the Vulgate, the Latin translation, that's made by Jerome, uses the Septuagint, but he also uses the Hebrew. So we have a witness to the Hebrew text, even though it's often interpreted in a sort of Septuagint kind of way. And the other one we've got is the Syriac translation, the Peshitta. That's possibly some Syrians claim that was made 2nd century BC. The more critical characters say 2nd century AD, but nonetheless, it's still a good independent witness. It's copied by the Syriac Church. It's a separate independent witness. And these are all independent. Masoretes copied the Masoretic text, the Hebrew current set of scribes in the Jewish community. The Targums are also copied, but they're copied in Aramaic, not in Hebrew, so they're copied by different scribes. Septuagint's in Greek, copied by the Greek Orthodox Church. Samaritan Pentateuch by the Samaritans. The Vulgate by the Roman Catholic Church. The Peshitta by the Syrian Church. So these aren't cross-copied. They don't compare with one another. We can look at separate independent witnesses, 6 of them there, 7 if you count the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they'll give a pretty similar picture of the text. There's a quick look at there's a table. So there are lots of independent witnesses to the text of the Old Testament. We don't have to worry about there being much change in the Old Testament. So the conclusion, independent witnesses, they're witnesses to the same text. Critics say, oh, well, the text evolved through the time. Well, these different witnesses show the same text at different stages. Maybe there's additional bits to help you pronounce it, but that's about it. And where there are variations between them, mostly extremely minor, we're talking about spelling mistakes. Remember that the 2 different Masoretic traditions, 8 consonants, or matres lecturis. So the biggest variation you've got is this Reader's Digest Jeremiah. And even the biggest of the variants there don't make any difference to the teaching of the Old Testament. It teaches exactly the same thing, even if you take the most wide variation you can from it, like actually is what happens in the New Revised Standard Version, which goes for the most radical differences in the Old Testament text. That we finish.